starting this year on Tuesday nights, on the second Tuesday of every month, we've been doing a kind of extended service. And the centerpiece of that service has been this sutra called the Universal Gateway. It's from the Lotus Sutra. And the Lotus Sutra is kind of too big a topic to handle. But what I'll say is the Lotus Sutra is huge. It's absolutely huge. And it covers an incredible breadth of topics. And so various traditions within the kind of Mahayana world draw on it in different ways, in ways that suit them. There's a little bit of something for everybody. And while Zen draws on the sutra as a whole, specifically it draws on two parts, the Universal Gateway chapter and one other. And these two, beyond being important teachings, become part of the liturgy. So that in temples and monasteries, these two sections from the Lotus Sutra are read over and over and over again out loud. They're considered fundamental. In this particular translation, I've messed with a little bit, and I wanted to explain that first. For those of you who have done this service before and have read it, you know there's this line, it says, by mindfully invoking the power of compassion. And in section after section, we're given a scenario, some negative scenario in which someone is in danger or someone is entrapped or someone is stuck. And then it says, by mindfully invoking the power of compassion, somehow the problem is solved. Well, the way that it's really written is that in most of those cases, there are a few compassions, but generally, instead of saying by mindfully invoking the power of compassion, what it says is by mindfully invoking the power of Avalokiteshvara. But I and a few other people in North America have adopted this other version where we say compassion instead. Well, why? I think there's a natural resistance and an understandable resistance and even a confusion that comes when we say that in this moment of distress that we're going to call on a being. That isn't to say that there's no value in that. That isn't to say that millions of people don't do that. But in order to call on that being, we need to understand who and what that being is. And Avalokiteshvara, whether presented holding a vase or with 10,000 arms, whichever version you might see, Avalokiteshvara, we say, is the bodhisattva of compassion. But she isn't a bodhisattva who represents compassion. She isn't a bodhisattva who happens to have a lot of compassion, or even a bodhisattva who operates from compassion. Avalokiteshvara is compassion. Avalokiteshvara is the embodiment of compassion. It's just compassion with a face. In the same way that when we speak of Manjushri, Manjushri is the bodhisattva of wisdom. That doesn't mean that he's a wise bodhisattva. He's a personification of wisdom itself. So while this does change the tone of the text, it's not a cheat, not really. Because when we invoke the power of Avalokiteshvara, we are saying we're invoking the power of compassion. Period. And why am I bringing this up today? We just started reading this again. We used to read it a few years ago when we would meet in person. And there are questions that came up then, and there are questions that come up now that I think are really important. Because this text raises some difficult points about suffering, about actual suffering. And I'll work backwards into it because a little later, after we've read through this for a while, the hardships get more supernatural. And so it says, if you meet evil creatures, poison dragons, or various demons, by mindfully invoking the power of compassion, none will dare to harm you. If surrounded by raging beasts with sharp fangs and dreadful claws, by mindfully invoking the power of compassion, they will quickly scatter in all directions. Situations we probably don't face, especially poison dragons. But to get there, we have to work through some other stuff that's a little more real. If persecuted by rulers, you face torture and execution. By mindfully invoking the power of compassion, their weapons will thereby shatter to pieces. If imprisoned in shackles and chains, hands and feet bound in restraints, by mindfully invoking the power of compassion, suddenly you shall be released. I think this is where some people pause. Because this isn't fantastical. This isn't some imaginary scenario. People have been bound in shackles and chains, and people still are bound in shackles and chains. And here we're saying out loud, if that's your situation, simply by mindfully invoking the power of compassion, you'll be free. I'm not an expert on the Lotus Sutra. I'm not an expert on this text. It's like with everything else. I've just done it a lot. I've read it a lot. It hits me in a particular way. There's a reason why I chose it for us to read. And so I just want to talk about how I understand the Universal Gateway. And for me, it comes down to two basic points. And the first one, which I think this is saying over and over and over again, is that there is no situation, no conceivable situation, even no inconceivable situation, because it goes to some kind of weird places, in which we are powerless. We may feel powerless. And yes, there are many situations that we can't fix on the surface. There are times when we can't get away. And the suffering described here is real. It's not some surface experience that, we think the right thing or we say the right thing and it disappears. But that whatever we face, we have this option. Usually we say when we're faced with danger, that there's fight or flight. Sometimes we say there's fight, flight, or freeze. This text, by constantly talking about mindfully invoking the power of compassion, is saying there's another option, there's another way. You can also run, of course. And you can also fight back, of course. But wherever you are, whatever you face, there is a kind of faith available. There is a different set of eyes. I have heard the most incredible stories about Tibetan monks who were held in Chinese prisons for decades after trying to leave Tibet. And what did they do as their lives were being taken from them, as they were being mistreated? They sat together and they practiced cultivating compassion for the people running the prison, for the guards, for their captors. For them, that was what freedom looked like. The freedom within the constraints of the real world. To choose not to hate. To choose, even in the most difficult circumstances, to recognize the other. Because especially when there's nowhere to go and there's nothing left to do, what else are you going to do? I find this so powerful and I find it so difficult. Because there are times when it makes perfect sense. If what we're working from is sense, it makes perfect sense to start to write people off. It makes perfect sense to say, why should I have the burden of compassion? But compassion isn't a burden. It isn't something we create. It isn't something we stir up through our will. It isn't work. And what this text is doing is it's pointing out all the times when it feels like work. It's saying, notice that. And because you're not being chased by poison dragons, because you're not being thrown off of Mount Sumeru's peak in this moment, start to notice what it means to rest in compassion now. Start to notice what it means to invoke the power of compassion now, when the stakes seem lower. How you can open to it, recognize it, make space for it. That's one part of what I hear, part of what challenges me here and what I find so beautiful. And then the other part is maybe a little more philosophical, which is that I hear in this universal gateway a reminder that there are no exceptions. Wisdom and compassion are the same thing. We sometimes talk about them as being two sides of one piece of paper. But one can't exist without the other. Which is to say that if you want to see a situation, no matter the situation, no matter how difficult or abhorrent the situation, if you want to see it with wisdom, with the eyes of wisdom, that means seeing it through the eyes of compassion. Period. I can't always do it. But I believe this. When I get really clear about something, when I am able to step back and see something in a bigger way, it gets bigger in every way. It opens instead of closing. And when that happens, compassion reveals itself. Sometimes just barely a taste. sometimes more. There's a really interesting dialogue that's happening right now, I think, within the Buddhist world. And in a way, it's about this text. It's saying oppression is real. Real people do bad things to real people. How are we supposed to feel about that? It's not all love and light. It's not easy. And so sometimes I read articles by Buddhist teachers who are saying, you know, there's a lot of talk about don't be angry. We should be angry. That's really compelling. But in this tradition, if we look at the precepts here, the precept is do not indulge in anger. It's a little different from don't be angry. And there's no footnote to it. It doesn't say there's a limit to this teaching. It doesn't say don't indulge in anger except when. It says never. Because when you do, you lose your access to wisdom. And when you lose access to wisdom, you lose access to compassion. Period. This, for me, is what is so powerful about so many teachings. And so dangerous in the way that we want to look at them. I can't tell you how many people have told me, yes, everything is impermanent except that one thing. We want there to be one thing. We want there to be one way out of the teaching that's really, really hard. This message about mindfully invoking the power of compassion, it isn't moral. It isn't saying you're a bad person if you don't. It's saying over and over, you can. Whatever situation you can imagine, you can. In the worst situation you can imagine, you can. Don't convince yourself otherwise. I think part of what's beautiful about it is that it mixes the supernatural with the real. We might smile a little bit as we are told, you know, how we can respond to poison dragons. You know, okay, yeah. Next time I run into that, I'll know just what to do. But then in the next verse, we're given an image of suffering that stings, that makes us pause because we should pause. It makes us pause because there we can actually imagine exactly why this is so hard. It's one thing to notice that you're not in a magical situation, but altogether different to notice that you're not in a situation that someone else is. And so maybe you mindfully invoke the power of compassion on their behalf. Because what else can you do? I don't really see any other way. I'll stop there.